It was a chilly morning in early spring when Tyrell Johnson's daily walk home from school took an unexpected turn. The sun had just begun to break through the heavy clouds, casting a muted light over the city streets. Tyrell, an ambitious 17-year-old high school senior, was focused on his usual route home. His mind raced with thoughts of upcoming exams, his dwindling scholarship prospects, and his mother's health issues. His mother, Angela, had been working herself to the bone for years, trying to provide for them after his father had left them when he was just a child. Every day, Tyrell tried to keep up appearances for his mom, telling her everything would be okay, even when he knew deep down that the pressure was too much for her. But on that particular morning, as he walked through the park on his way home, his thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a man sitting alone on a bench. The man looked out of place, as though he didn't belong there. His clothes were ragged and torn, his hair long and matted with dirt. A layer of grime covered his face, making it difficult to discern his age. His hands, gripped around a crumpled paper cup, shook slightly as if he hadn't eaten or slept in days. Tyrell had passed homeless people in the city countless times, so he initially thought nothing of it. Yet, something about this man caught his attention. He wasn't begging for change or shouting at the passers-by. Instead, he sat quietly, staring into the distance with an almost haunted expression, as if lost in thought. Tyrell slowed his pace as he neared the bench. The man's eyes flickered upward, locking with Tyrell's for just a moment. Tyrell froze. There was something strange in the way the man looked at him, an intensity in his gaze that Tyrell couldn't quite place. He felt an odd, unexplainable pull to him. The man's eyes seemed tired, burdened by years of struggle, and yet there was a flicker of something else in them, something Tyrell could almost recognize. Without thinking, Tyrell approached the man. He wasn't sure why he did it. There was something about this moment that felt different from the usual encounters with the homeless. He knelt beside the man, his heart beating faster. "Hey," Tyrell said cautiously. "Are you okay? Do you need some food?" The man didn't respond right away. His lips twitched as though he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I could use something to eat," he murmured, his voice rough and low. Tyrell, who had just bought a sandwich from a nearby vendor, pulled it out of his bag and handed it to the man. "Here," he said. "I've got a sandwich. You can have it." The man stared at the sandwich for a moment before looking back up at Tyrell. There was something in his eyes now, a kind of surprise, perhaps even disbelief. "Thank you," the man said quietly, taking the sandwich with trembling hands. Tyrell watched him for a moment. His heart went out to the man. He had seen homeless people on the streets before, but this was different. Most of the time, people were either too ashamed or too proud to accept help. But this man, his face etched with lines of struggle and regret, seemed almost grateful. Tyrell felt a sense of deep empathy stir within him, and he sat down on the edge of the bench, just to keep the man company. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Neither of them knew what to say, but Tyrell didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Instead, he simply watched as the man tore into the sandwich, his hands shaking slightly. It was clear that he hadn't eaten in a while. As the man ate, Tyrell couldn't help but wonder how someone could end up like this. Was it bad luck? Poor decisions? Was this man's story something he could ever understand? Tyrell didn't know, but he found himself wanting to know more. He wanted to know who this man was, what had happened to him, and why he seemed so familiar. Once the man finished the sandwich, he leaned back on the bench, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes were still distant, but there was a flicker of appreciation. He turned to Tyrell, finally speaking with more clarity than before. "You don't know who I am, do you?" the man asked, his voice steady now. Tyrell shook his head, puzzled. "No, should I?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "I suppose not. Most people don't recognize me these days." There was a moment of silence before he continued. "My name is Victor Stone." Tyrell's mind raced as he heard the name. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He had heard it somewhere. He was sure of it. Victor Stone. Tyrell repeated, "I'm not sure I know you." Victor's eyes grew distant again, but his expression remained calm. "Not many do anymore," he muttered. "But I used to be someone important. I used to run a tech company, built an empire from nothing. People knew my name once." Tyrell blinked, confused. "A tech company?" he asked, incredulously. "Like a billionaire or something?" Victor nodded, his eyes looking haunted now, as though the memories weighed heavily on him. "Yeah, I built something. Huge. People loved what I created. I was a millionaire, a billionaire. And then I lost it all." Tyrell's jaw dropped as he processed what Victor had said. This man, sitting on a park bench in torn clothes, was once a billionaire. It was hard to believe, but there was something in Victor's voice, an unmistakable truth, that made Tyrell realize this wasn't a lie. Something had happened to him, and whatever it was had completely changed his life. Tyrell didn't know what to say. He sat there, stunned by the revelation. He had seen plenty of homeless people before, but he had never met anyone like this. He had never met someone who had experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. It was a story that most people wouldn't believe. After a long moment, Victor broke the silence. "I'm not proud of what happened, but I've got no one left. No family, no friends. Just me and the streets now." Tyrell nodded, feeling a surge of sympathy. He didn't know what to do with this information, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary encounter. Something told him that this was just the beginning of a story he couldn't yet fully understand. As he stood to leave, Victor reached out a hand, gripping Tyrell's arm with surprising strength. "You're a good kid, Tyrell," Victor said softly. "Don't let the world make you hard. Remember, kindness is the one thing they can't take from you." Tyrell's heart skipped a beat as he nodded, feeling a strange connection with the man before him. He didn't fully understand what had happened to Victor or why he was here. But one thing was clear. Tyrell wouldn't forget this moment. He couldn't. And somehow, deep down, he felt that Victor's story was far from over. The surprise was only just beginning. Tyrell walked home in a daze, his mind swirling with the unexpected encounter. Victor Stone. The name echoed in his head, but try as he might, he couldn't place it. His fingers brushed against the remnants of the sandwich he'd given away, now crushed in the pocket of his jacket. The uneaten half had slipped through his grasp as he left the bench, but he didn't feel the hunger gnawing at him in the usual way. Something about the conversation with Victor had left him feeling both unsettled and strangely inspired. The homeless man's words lingered in his thoughts, the weight of his past somehow carried in his eyes. At home, his mother was already preparing dinner, her hands moving automatically as she stirred a pot on the stove. Angela Johnson, Tyrell's mother, had always been the epitome of strength. Even when the days were long and exhausting, she would smile through it all, determined to keep their lives as normal as possible. But Tyrell knew better. He knew the toll it was taking on her, long shifts at the local diner, just enough to pay the rent, keeping food on the table, making sure he never felt the burden of their financial troubles. Her skin was starting to show the years of hard work, the worry lines deepening as her health began to show signs of wear. Tyrell had been trying to hide the reality of their situation for as long as possible, but the cracks were starting to show. "Hey, Mom," Tyrell greeted her, dropping his backpack beside the couch. "How's it going?" Angela looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Same as usual, baby. Just another day in paradise." Her voice held a tinge of sarcasm, but she was trying, as always, to keep things light. She poured him a glass of water and placed it on the table. Tyrell sat down at the table, his mind still on Victor. He wanted to ask his mother if she knew who he was, but something told him she wouldn't. Victor had said he was once someone important, but that didn't fit with the person Tyrell had just met. "No, Victor was a man who had clearly fallen from a great height, his pride and mistakes written all over his weathered face. But it was his eyes that haunted Tyrell. There was a story there, one that couldn't be easily understood or explained. As dinner was served, Tyrell couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. It was as though he had glimpsed something larger than himself, a world of possibilities that he hadn't even realized existed. It wasn't just the connection with Victor that had struck him. It was the fact that there was someone out there who had been at the very top, someone who had created something from nothing and yet had lost it all. Tyrell couldn't stop thinking about the choices Victor had made, the fall from grace, and the emptiness that came with losing everything. For the next few days, Tyrell found himself drawn back to the park, a place he usually passed by without a second thought. He didn't go there out of obligation, but out of curiosity, a deep, unrelenting need to understand what had happened to Victor. Every day after school, Tyrell would find his way to the park, hoping to see the man again. And on the fourth day, there he was. Victor sat on the same bench, this time with his head down, staring at his hands. Tyrell hesitated, but not for long. He had to know more. "Hey, Victor," Tyrell said, approaching cautiously. "How's it going?" Victor looked up slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus. For a moment, Tyrell thought he might not even recognize him. But then a faint glimmer of recognition passed across his face. "Ah, the kid," Victor murmured. He smiled faintly, though it was a smile tinged with sadness. "I didn't expect to see you again." Tyrell sat down beside him on the bench, this time without any hesitation. There was no awkward silence this time. There was an unspoken understanding between them. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Tyrell began, not knowing exactly where to start. "About your company, and how you lost it all." Victor looked at him, his gaze almost unreadable. After a long pause, he let out a long sigh. "You're curious, huh? Most people would rather avoid asking questions like that. They don't want to hear the truth, I suppose." Tyrell nodded. "I guess I just want to understand. I mean, you were at the top, right? You had everything. How does someone go from that to this?" His voice trailed off, gesturing vaguely to the worn-out park bench, the empty streets, the world that had swallowed Victor whole. Victor's laugh was low, bitter. "It's not as glamorous as it sounds, kid. It wasn't the money that mattered, you know. It was the control, the power. And when you think you're invincible, when you think you can't lose, that's when the world has a way of reminding you just how fragile everything really is." Tyrell looked at him, fascinated despite himself. "What happened?" Victor's eyes grew distant as he leaned back on the bench. "I was a tech guy, once. Built an app that revolutionized the way people interacted with the world. It was my dream. I worked day and night, poured everything into it. People loved it. Investors backed me. I had it all. Money, fame, respect. But along the way, I made enemies. People who thought I was getting too big. People I trusted, who turned on me. I wasn't careful. I didn't see the danger until it was too late." Victor's voice grew softer, more reflective. "I lost my company because I let greed and pride get the best of me. I trusted the wrong people, made deals that destroyed everything I built. The worst part was, I didn't even see it coming. One minute, I was on top of the world, and the next, it all came crashing down. My family left me, my partners abandoned me, and the company I spent years building was stolen from me in the blink of an eye. And here I am." Tyrell sat there, processing the weight of Victor's words. It was hard to believe that the man in front of him had once been a giant in the tech world. To think that someone could lose everything, not just once, but in a way that left them broken, alone, was something Tyrell couldn't fully grasp. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's story wasn't just about failure. It was about something deeper. It was about a fall, yes, but also about the possibility of redemption. Tyrell felt a strange kinship with Victor, even though their lives were worlds apart. They both had dreams, both had faced hardships, But Tyrell hadn't yet experienced the depths of loss that Victor had. And maybe he never would. But somehow, Victor's story was a warning. A reminder that success wasn't just about what you achieved. It was about how you stayed grounded when everything around you seemed to be slipping away. Victor's gaze shifted to Tyrell, and for the first time, Tyrell saw something like hope flicker in those tired eyes. "You remind me of myself, kid," Victor said softly. "You've got that fire in you, that drive to make something of yourself. But you've got to be careful. Life doesn't always go according to plan. And sometimes you lose everything before you realize what really matters." Tyrell swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The weight of Victor's words lingered in the air, thick with meaning. "I won't forget," Tyrell said quietly. "I won't forget what you've said." Victor nodded, a faint, almost sad smile appearing on his face. "I hope not. It's never too late to change, but you've got to make the right choices. Don't let the world swallow you whole." Tyrell stood up, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the park. "I'll see you tomorrow, Victor. Take care." As Tyrell walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, that somehow, in this strange encounter with a man who had lost everything, he was beginning to understand what truly mattered. He didn't know how or why, but he was certain of one thing. This wasn't the last time he would see Victor Stone. The days that followed felt like a blur for Tyrell. School was becoming more of a chore than ever before, as the weight of his mother's health and his dwindling scholarship prospects pressed down on him like a heavy cloud. Every time he sat down to study, he couldn't help but think of Victor. The homeless man who had once been a tech mogul, now living on the streets with nothing but his stories and regrets. Tyrell had seen the way Victor's eyes had changed when he talked about his past, a mix of bitterness and sorrow that he didn't fully understand. But the more Tyrell thought about it, the more his encounter with Victor seemed to have stirred something inside him. A curiosity, a drive, a hunger for something greater than the struggles he was facing. It wasn't just the idea of meeting someone who had fallen from such great heights that intrigued him. It was the way Victor had spoken, so matter-of-factly, as though he had already come to terms with his loss. In some strange way, it gave Tyrell hope. If Victor could lose everything and still hold on to his humanity, then maybe Tyrell could face his own challenges and come out stronger on the other side. But hope wasn't always enough. He needed something more tangible, something he could use to lift his family out of their situation. So, every day after school, Tyrell returned to the park, hoping to find Victor again. The first few days, he didn't see him. It was as if the park had swallowed him up entirely. But Tyrell kept coming back, driven by a sense of purpose he didn't quite understand, a feeling that there was something important he was supposed to learn from this encounter. And then, almost a week later, Tyrell saw him again. Victor was sitting in the same spot, though his posture seemed slumped, as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. Tyrell approached him slowly, unsure of what to say. The park was quiet that day, with only a few people scattered across the benches. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and Tyrell could feel the cool breeze cutting through his jacket as he walked up to the bench. "Hey, Victor," he said, his voice steady, but not without a hint of uncertainty. Victor looked up at him, his tired eyes recognizing him instantly. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by a faint smile. "Back again, huh?" Victor's voice was hoarse, but it held a warmth that surprised Tyrell. "You've got a lot of perseverance, I'll give you that." Tyrell sat down next to him, the bench creaking under his weight. I need to talk," he said, his voice betraying his unease. Victor turned to him, raising an eyebrow, but said nothing. It was clear that Victor had been waiting for Tyrell to say something. Tyrell hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He had so many questions swirling in his mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. How could he possibly ask about Victor's past without sounding like he was prying? What did he even want to know? Finally, he blurted it out. "How did you end up like this?" The words came out more harshly than he intended, but the truth was, Tyrell needed to know. He needed to understand how a man could go from owning the world to losing everything. Victor didn't flinch at the question. Instead, he let out a deep breath and stared ahead at the cloudy sky, his hands resting on his knees. "It's a long story, kid," Victor said after a long pause. "A painful one, too. But I'll tell you, because you seem like you might understand." Tyrell nodded, though he couldn't explain why he felt so compelled to listen. There was something about Victor that made him feel like he was supposed to hear this story. "I was at the top, like you said," Victor began, his voice distant now, as though he were speaking to someone far away. "Built an empire, one that was supposed to change the world. I had everything: money, respect, power, but what I didn't have was humility. I didn't know how to trust the right people, and I didn't know how to handle success. I thought I could handle anything, but nothing could touch me. But when you're at the top, the fall is always waiting." Tyrell listened intently, trying to imagine what it must have been like to have everything one day and lose it all the next. "I trusted the wrong people," Victor continued. "People who told me what I wanted to hear, not what I needed to hear. People who saw my success as a way to get ahead themselves. I ignored the signs. When the financial crash hit, I wasn't prepared. My company went under, investors pulled out, and I couldn't recover. But it wasn't just the company I lost. I lost my family, my friends, my sense of who I was. When you lose everything like that, it doesn't just take your possessions. It takes your soul." Victor paused, his hand tightening into a fist, as though the memory of it all was too much to bear. "I thought I could rebuild," Victor said, his voice softening. "But it was too late. People had already moved on, and I was just another has-been. The people I thought I could rely on didn't give a damn, and when you've been at the top, you can't just go back to being normal. It's like you're trapped in the shadow of your own past. So I ended up here, living on the streets, no place to call home, just surviving." Tyrell didn't know what to say. He had heard stories of people falling from grace before, but hearing it from someone who had actually lived it, who had lost everything and was now sitting beside him, a broken shell of his former self, was something entirely different. Tyrell could feel the weight of Victor's words pressing down on him, the intensity of his regrets and lost opportunities hanging in the air. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Tyrell didn't know how to comfort someone who had already experienced the worst. He didn't know what to say to someone who had given up everything. But one thing was clear: Victor's story wasn't just about losing everything. It was about learning from the past and finding a way to rise again. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "I don't know what the future holds for me, kid. But I do know one thing: life can break you. But it doesn't have to define you. You get to choose how you respond. That's the one thing you have control over." Tyrell looked at Victor, a new understanding forming in his mind. He didn't know what was coming next, whether he would be able to help his family, or whether he would fall victim to the same mistakes that Victor had made. But something had shifted inside him. The weight of his circumstances felt a little lighter now, like maybe there was a way out. Maybe there was something he could learn from Victor's story, something he could apply to his own life to keep from making the same mistakes. Victor looked at him with a steady gaze. "Remember this, kid. No matter what happens, you have to keep moving forward. You can't let fear of failure keep you from trying. The hardest part is getting up after you fall. Don't forget that." Tyrell nodded, feeling something deep inside him click into place. "I won't," he said, his voice steady. And with that, the weight of Victor's words settled in Tyrell's heart, a constant reminder that even in the face of failure, there was always a chance to begin again. The weeks that followed seemed to stretch out endlessly for Tyrell. Each day felt like it weighed heavier than the last, as his struggles piled on top of one another. The exams were coming up, and his grades were slipping. His scholarship prospects were dwindling with every passing day, and his mother's health continued to worsen. Tyrell watched as she became more frail, her energy slowly sapping away as she worked herself harder than ever just to keep them afloat. He could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the worry, and the quiet desperation that she was trying so hard to hide. It broke his heart, and the helplessness he felt in those moments was almost unbearable. But amidst all of this, Tyrell found himself returning to the park, drawn inexplicably to Victor. He didn't really know why he felt this pull, this need to hear more of the old man's story, but it was as though something about Victor's experience had resonated with him in ways that he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just the idea that Victor had once been someone important. It was more than that. It was the realization that, despite everything, Victor hadn't given up. Despite his fall from grace, despite losing everything, he still had a kind of wisdom that Tyrell knew he needed to hear. Tyrell had learned to appreciate the quiet moments with Victor, the times when they didn't need to say anything but simply existed together, sharing a kind of unspoken understanding. But on this particular day, as Tyrell walked toward the park after another disheartening afternoon at school, something felt different. There was a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense that things were about to change. He didn't know how or why, but he felt it. The park, usually bustling with people on their lunch breaks, was eerily empty today. The sound of distant traffic and rustling leaves filled the air, but other than that, there was no one around. It felt like the calm before a storm. Tyrell's heart skipped a beat when he spotted Victor sitting on the same bench where they'd had their previous conversations. But something was different this time. Victor was staring straight ahead, his face etched with worry, his eyes clouded by something Tyrell couldn't place. There was an intensity to him now, a kind of urgency in the air that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Victor," Tyrell called out, trying to mask the nervous energy buzzing in his chest. "You okay?" Victor's head turned slowly, his tired eyes meeting Tyrell's with an expression that was hard to read. He looked at the young man for a long moment, his gaze lingering before he finally spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "You've been coming around here a lot," Victor said, his tone laced with an unspoken question. "What's been going on with you? You look different." Tyrell sat down next to him, his stomach tightening. The weight of his own burdens was beginning to press down on him in ways that felt suffocating. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know if he could even share everything that had been building up inside him. But as he looked at Victor, this man who had been through so much and still managed to hold on to some semblance of hope, Tyrell realized that it was time to face the truth. "My mom's not doing well," Tyrell said, his voice quiet. "She's been getting worse. I think she's sicker than she's letting on. But she won't go to the doctor, won't even take a break. And me, I've been fighting so hard to get this scholarship, to get out of here and give her a better life. But my grades are slipping. It feels like I'm losing everything. Like nothing I do is ever going to be enough." Victor's eyes softened, a knowing sadness in them that Tyrell couldn't ignore. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the city beyond the park. Tyrell's heart raced, his mind spinning, as he waited for Victor's response. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew he needed something, anything, to help him make sense of the chaos in his life. "You're doing the best you can, kid," Victor said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low but steady. "And sometimes, the best you can do isn't enough. But that doesn't mean you stop trying. It doesn't mean you give up. You're not alone in this, even when it feels like it." Tyrell blinked, not entirely sure what Victor meant by those words. He'd heard people say things like that before. Motivational speeches, pep talks, the kind of stuff that always seemed hollow. But when Victor spoke, it felt different. It felt real. "Sometimes you'll hit rock bottom, and you'll think there's no way out," Victor continued, his voice thick with experience. "And maybe there isn't. Maybe there's no way back to where you were. But there's always a way forward, even if it's just a small step at a time." Tyrell wanted to believe those words. He wanted to believe that things could get better, that he could rise above the mess that his life had become. But how? How could he possibly turn things around when everything was stacked against him? How could he change his situation when it felt like every door was closing in his face? "You're a good kid," Victor said, as if reading his thoughts. "You've got a lot of heart. That's something most people lose when they get older. They get jaded. They stop caring. But you haven't lost that. And that's a gift. Don't ever forget that." The words lingered in his mind long after he went to bed that night. The fear didn't vanish, but somehow it felt more manageable. His mother's confidence in him had always been unwavering, and her belief in his potential was something that had carried him through the darkest times. Now he had to believe in himself, just as she believed in him. The next morning, as Tyrell packed the last of his things into the car, he felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, fear, anticipation, and a deep sadness that he couldn't quite name. His mother stood in the doorway, watching him with a quiet pride, though her eyes were filled with unshed tears. "Take care of yourself, okay?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll be here, waiting for you. And remember, don't be afraid to fail. It's okay to fall. What matters is that you get back up." Tyrell hugged her tightly, his heart swelling with love for the woman who had given him everything. He hadn't always understood the sacrifices she had made for him. But in that moment, it all became clear. She had fought so hard to give him a future, and now it was his turn to step into that future, even if it meant walking away from everything he knew. The drive to Riverstone University was a blur, the miles passing in a haze of uncertainty and anticipation. As they pulled up to the campus, Tyrell felt a lump in his throat. The sprawling grounds of the university were beautiful, but it all felt so foreign to him. This wasn't the small town he had grown up in. It wasn't the park where he'd met Victor, or the cramped apartment where he'd shared countless quiet moments with his mother. This was a new world, one that held endless possibilities, but also an overwhelming sense of being out of place. As he stepped out of the car, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. A group of students were walking past, chatting excitedly about their classes and the upcoming semester. Tyrell watched them for a moment, feeling like an outsider in their world. But then, just as he was about to retreat into himself, he remembered something that Victor had told him. "You remind me of myself," he had said. "You've got that fire in you." Tyrell squared his shoulders, his heart pounding with the weight of it all. He was no longer the kid who felt like he had to shrink back. He wasn't the kid who had been afraid of his own potential. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let fear dictate his next move. The first few days at Riverstone were a whirlwind of orientation, meeting new people, and trying to find his place in a world that felt so different from everything he knew. Tyrell quickly realized that the campus was filled with students who came from backgrounds of privilege, who seemed to fit seamlessly into the world around them. There were moments when he felt like he didn't belong, moments when he looked around at the luxury dorms and the students with their expensive clothes and wondered if he was out of his depth. But he didn't let it stop him. He remembered Victor's words, "Don't let the world swallow you whole." And so, despite the insecurities that bubbled up within him, Tyrell kept pushing forward. He joined study groups, attended events, and made an effort to get to know people. Slowly, he started to feel like he was finding his rhythm. The more he interacted with others, the more he realized that no one had it all figured out, no matter how perfect their lives seemed from the outside. They were all just trying to figure out their place in the world, just like him. As the weeks went by, Tyrell began to feel more at home. He found himself thriving in his classes, soaking up every bit of knowledge he could. He discovered a passion for business and technology, subjects that had always intrigued him, but had seemed so out of reach in the past. He began to dream again, not just of surviving, but of building something meaningful, something that could change the world in the way that Victor had once hoped his company would. And then one day, as Tyrell sat in the library, buried in his textbooks, his phone buzzed with a familiar number. It was Victor. "Hey," "Kid," Victor's voice came through the phone, rough but steady. "How's it going? You surviving out there?" Tyrell smiled, the sound of Victor's voice bringing back a flood of memories. "I'm doing more than surviving, Victor. I'm thriving. It's hard, but I'm finding my way." "I knew you would," Victor said. "You've got what it takes. Just don't forget where you came from. Okay? And don't let anyone tell you who you're supposed to be. Keep being you." Tyrell felt a wave of gratitude flood over him. In a world where he had often felt out of place, Victor had been the one person who had always believed in him. And now, Tyrell was learning to believe in himself, to trust that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. As the months passed, Tyrell found himself growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He continued to excel academically, building relationships with mentors and classmates who encouraged him to reach even higher. He kept in touch with his mother, calling her every week, telling her about the progress he was making and reassuring her that he was on the right path. One afternoon, as Tyrell sat in a campus cafe, he received another call, this time from a startup company looking to offer him an internship for the summer. It was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of. And in that moment, he realized that the life he had once thought was impossible was now within his grasp. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Tyrell was no longer afraid. He had come a long way from the kid sitting on the park bench, unsure of who he was or what he could become. Now, as he looked out at the horizon, he knew that his journey was only just beginning, and whatever happened next, he was ready for it. Tyrell had stepped into a future he had once thought was out of reach, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him from making it his own. "Hey, kid," Victor's voice came through the phone, rough but steady. "How's it going? You surviving out there?" Tyrell smiled, the sound of Victor's voice bringing back a flood of memories. "I'm doing more than surviving, Victor. I'm thriving. It's hard, but I'm finding my way." "I knew you would," Victor said. "You've got what it takes. Just don't forget where you came from. Okay? And don't let anyone tell you who you're supposed to be. Keep being you." Tyrell felt a wave of gratitude flood over him. In a world where he had often felt out of place, Victor had been the one person who had always believed in him. And now, Tyrell was learning to believe in himself, to trust that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. As the months passed, Tyrell found himself growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He continued to excel academically, building relationships with mentors and classmates who encouraged him to reach even higher. He kept in touch with his mother, calling her every week, telling her about the progress he was making and reassuring her that he was on the right path. One afternoon, as Tyrell sat in a campus cafe, he received another call, this time from a startup company looking to offer him an internship for the summer. It was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of, and in that moment, he realized that the life he had once thought was impossible was now within his grasp. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Tyrell was no longer afraid. He had come a long way from the kid sitting on the park bench, unsure of who he was or what he could become. Now, as he looked out at the horizon, he knew that his journey was only just beginning, and whatever happened next, he was ready for it. Tyrell had stepped into a future he had once thought was out of reach, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him from making it his own.